Chapter 28 of the Brooklyn Murders. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganandh. The Brooklyn Murders by G.D.H. Cole. Chapter 28. The Superintendent's Theory. When Inspector Blaikie reported to Superintendent Wilson the results of his conversation with Carter Woodman, he had formed no definite theory. He explained without comment the precise terms of the will, stating that if Walter Brooklyn had been removed, Carter Woodman, as next of kin, would have become the principal beneficiary. He was not prepared for the conclusion which his superior immediately drew on hearing that this was the case. "Then Carter Woodman is the murderer," said the superintendent with an air of finality. "If we had known these facts before, it would have saved a world of trouble." "But," said Inspector Blaikie, "Carter Woodman appears to have a perfect alibi. He was in the Cunningham Hotel at the time when the murders were committed. At least that seemed to be an undoubted fact when we investigated his movements." "My dear Inspector, it does not follow that. Because Walter Brooklyn's alibi proved to be sound, all alibis are therefore equally sound. I do not need to remind you that alibis can be faked." "Quite so, sir. But aren't you rather hasty in leaping to the conclusion that Woodman is guilty? We have really nothing against him except a suggestion of motive. As matters stand now, he has gained absolutely nothing by the murders." "Perhaps not, though it's not safe to be too sure on that point. We may not know all the circumstances, but if you're right, don't you see that the very fact that, as matters stand now, he has gained nothing is a very strong reason for suspecting him?" The inspector failed to follow his reasoning. "Why do you say that?" he asked. "I can't see it at all." "Well, it's clear that the murderer, whoever he was, did his level best to get Walter Brooklyn hanged. Who stood to gain by getting Walter Brooklyn out of the way?" "I see. Carter Woodman. Yes, I follow now. That is one strong point against him. Here's another. Do you remember where Walter Brooklyn thought he had left his stick on Tuesday afternoon? He went back to look for it, do you remember?" The inspector thought for a moment. "In Carter Woodman's office," he said at last. "Well then, isn't it clear that he did leave his stick in Woodman's office? Woodman found it, but denied the fact when Walter called to fetch it, and told him he must have left it in the taxi. Then Woodman deliberately planted the stick on the scene of Princip's murder. That's pure hypothesis. I don't say it isn't true, but it's more than hypothesis. It is divination. Surely you see that it must be what happened." "I expect as usual you're right," said the inspector. "But will it convince a jury? I have tried all I know to get any evidence showing when the stick was left, but not a trace can I find. A jury will regard it as a pure hypothesis." The superintendent sighed. "Juries are sadly lacking in appreciation of the subtleties of reasoning." "You're quite right there," he said. "My divination won't hang Carter Woodman, but it convinces you as it convinced me. We have to get faith in our own knowledge before we can make a case that will persuade others. You and I now have that faith. We know that Carter Woodman is guilty. But even you can't prove it." "Not yet. But it will be proved. And now I come to a third point. You remember that written message that was found in the garden near George Brooklyn's body? The scrap of paper you picked up? It was in Princip's writing." "Yes, I remember. Have you thought any more about the scrap of paper? Or have you just assumed that it was a request by Princip that George Brooklyn should meet him in the garden?" "There didn't seem to be much to be gleaned from it." "There I think you're wrong. I want to know exactly when that piece of paper was found, and by whom." "We found it in the garden that morning, when we were looking for clues after finding George Brooklyn's body." "Who actually found it?" "I suppose I did. No, I remember now. It was Carter Woodman who directed my attention to it. It was lying in a corner in the summer house, the place they call the Temple." "My dear Inspector," said the superintendent excitedly, "do you realize the significance of what you have just said? Woodman took good care that you should discover that piece of paper, because he had put it there for you to find." The superintendent said these last words slowly and with very great emphasis. The inspector scratched his head thoughtfully. "I believe you're right," he said. "It was after we had finished our first search that Woodman drew my attention to the scrap of paper. He was afraid you would fail to notice it." I can see that you are right, sir. But there again you have a thing which will not convince a jury for a moment. Your reasoning will seem to them fantastic. I only know you are right because you always are right when you make a long guess like that. But need it be only a guess? Look here. And Superintendent Wilson pushed a scrap of paper across his subordinate. Take a good look. Do you see anything curious about it? It's written oddly near the edge of the paper. Yes, that is the point. The writing is right up to the top of the paper, and immediately above the writing is a torn edge. The paper, as we said before, is a sheet torn from a memorandum book found in Princep's room. But it is not a complete sheet. About an inch has been nearly torn off the top of the sheet. Is that a natural thing for Princep to have done? And does the writing look natural as it does now on the sheet? The inspector looked again at the note. No, it certainly does not, he said. Doesn't that suggest anything to you? Do you mean that this is only part of the message? That's exactly what I do mean. The message now says only meet me in the garden, J.P. Probably what it said originally was, dear so-and-so, whatever the name may have been, and I don't believe it was George. Meet me in the garden, J.P. There may have been a date too at the top of the note. You mean that this note, though it was written by Princep, was not written with reference to the particular occasion we were concerned with? Precisely. Now I suppose there is no hope of finding the missing part of that memorandum slip, but I am convinced that is what happened. The inspector made a sudden exclamation. Good Lord, what a fool I have been, he said. How do you mean? Said the superintendent sharply. Why, I actually found what must have been the missing part of the slip when I was searching Princep's room. I thought nothing of it at the time. You have it now? The inspector shook his head ruefully. No, he said. It has gone west. When I searched the room, I naturally looked in the grate. There had been a fire, and on the hearth was a half-burnt scrap of paper. What was on it? Nothing but the name of a day at the head. Monday it was, and one word. The rest was burnt. It had evidently fallen out of the grate. The word was man. Just man. Nothing else. The superintendent gave an excited laugh. Now I know what the note contained, he said. Monday. Dear Woodman, meet me in the garden. J.P. How does that strike you? The note was from Princep to Woodman, but it was written on the day before the murders. Lord, what a pity you didn't keep the fragment. My dear Inspector, never destroy anything. That's the only safe course for a man like you. I did show it to the sergeant, sir, said the inspector, considerably crestfallen at his superior's tone. Come, that's a bit better. The judge will probably accept your combined testimonies. It's a great pity, though, you didn't realize the importance of the scrap of chart paper. However, for our own purposes at least, I think we can take it as proved that Woodman deliberately prepared and planted that note on the scene of the crime, believing that the other piece was safely burnt in the fire in Princep's room. Our case against Woodman is mounting up. Come, Inspector, you must follow up these new clues at once. Don't forget Woodman's alibi. That still holds unless we can shake it. It must be our next business to shake it. We now know that Woodman did leave the Cunningham Hotel that evening. It's your job to discover how he left it and how he got into Liskeet House. Make these the next points, Inspector. I'll do my best, sir. And there is one other matter I should tell you about, though in the light of our discoveries, it's now probably of quite minor importance, I think. Still, we must not be too cocksure or neglect any fact that may possibly bear on the case. If you are right about Woodman, then he planned the whole affair very carefully, but he took a big risk all the same. Having you to reckon with? Yes. Well, I doubt if a man would take a risk of that magnitude without some very urgent reason, such as grave and immediate financial embarrassment. I want you to look into Woodman's record, make inquiries about him in the city, and see if he appears to be in Queer Street or anything of that sort. It wouldn't prove anything if he were. No, but it would greatly strengthen our case on the question of motive. It's worth looking into at all events. And now, Inspector, I won't keep you. There's work to do, and you had best be getting about it. And I want to do some more thinking in this case. It gets interesting. The end of chapter 28. Chapter 29 of the Brooklyn Murders by G.D.H. Cole. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganandh. The Brooklyn Murders by G.D.H. Cole. Chapter 29. The Lie of the Land. When Joan and Ellery determined upon their course of action, Ellery's immediate part was to make a thorough investigation of Carter Woodman's movements. Apparently, he had a perfect alibi, as good as Ellery's own, absolving him of all part in the events of the fatal Tuesday night. Indeed, in the eyes of law, he had scarcely needed an alibi, for nothing had occurred to throw any real suspicion upon him. Ellery suspected him nevertheless, almost to certainty, but he admitted to himself that even now his suspicion was based on what others would regard as no more than a guess. Tuesday, therefore, seemed the best starting point, for if Woodman's alibi for the occasion held good, that would finish the matter and prove that the whole edifice of suppositions which Ellery had built up was founded on nothing. It was easy enough for Ellery to walk into the Cunningham Hotel, where he was already known, under pretext of a visit to Marianne Brooklyn. But having made his entry, he did not proceed to the suite of rooms which he shared with the Woodmans. His object was to explore the hotel in order to discover whether there was in fact, as the porter and the manager had stated to Inspector Blaikie, only one possible exit. The porter, who had been at the door from 10 o'clock onwards through the night, had been quite certain that Woodman had not gone out that way. He had come in with his wife and Mrs. Brooklyn at about 10:15, and he had not returned to the entrance hall until about 11:45, when he had given the porter his late letters for the post and had gone straight upstairs again. That seemed clear enough, for the porter was very positive that Woodman had not gone out at any time during the evening. There was, the manager had told the police, another exit of course for the hotel servants, but the only way to this from the club quarters lay through the great kitchen, and it would be quite impossible for a guest to leave by this way without being observed. Ellery had chosen 11 o'clock at night for his visit to the hotel, and meeting the manager whom he knew, he asked to be shown into the kitchens. The management was excessively proud of these and made a regular show of them to its guests. The manager readily agreed to take him round, and even a cursory inspection was enough to show Ellery that, even at that hour in the evening, no guest could possibly have left by the servants' exit without being seen by at least half a dozen persons. The preparation of theatre suppers was in full swing, and the kitchens were alive with chefs and waiters at least until midnight. Leaving the manager, as if he were going up to the Woodman's apartment, Ellery resumed his prowl. On the ground floor, he speedily discovered there was no possible means of exit except the main door. There remained the basement, occupied mainly by a vast grilled room, which was closed at 10 o'clock. Ellery descended the stairs and pushed open the grilled room door communicating with the hotel. The place was in darkness, and without turning on the light, he made a tour of the huge room. At the far end were cloakrooms, another flight of stairs communicating with the street. So far, it would be fully possible for a guest to make his way without attracting attention. Ellery went up the far stairs and approached the door leading from the grilled room to the street. It was heavily barred and bolted, as well as locked, but the key was on the lock, and there seemed to be nothing to prevent the bolts from being withdrawn from the inside. As quietly as he could, Ellery took down the bars, slid back the bolts, and unlocked the door. He stood not in the street, but in a small outer hall with another locked door in front of him. This door also could be undone from the inside, and opening it cautiously, Ellery found himself looking out into St. John Street. He had established the fact that it was possible at night for a guest to leave the Cunningham Hotel unobserved. Quietly he relocked the doors and slid back the well-oiled bolts and bars, surprised for the second time to find how little noise his operations made. Woodman then could have both left and returned to the hotel without being seen. But had he? The very lack of possible observers seemed to make it impossible to prove the case either for or against him. If no one had seen Ellery make his investigations, and as he returned to the ground floor, he was certain that no one had noticed him, at least until he reached the top of the basement stairs, why should anyone have seen Carter Woodman when he had followed the same route? The effect of Ellery's investigations was to make Woodman's alibi insecure, but it afforded absolutely no positive evidence of his guilt. Still, it was something to have shown that the alibi was not conclusive, and Ellery was fairly well pleased with the result of his visit. But he had not yet done. According to Woodman's story, he had written his letters in a small and little-used writing room on the first floor at the opposite end of the hotel from his own rooms, but quite near the basement stairs, to which another small flight of stairs led directly from the first floor, almost from the writing room door. Ellery went into the writing room and found it deserted. He remembered that Woodman had stated that he had had it to himself throughout the time he had spent there. Ellery had no definite idea that the writing room would yield a clue, but he thought that he might as well have a look round. He glanced at the blotting pads which lay on each table, only to see that the blotting paper was evidently changed very frequently. But picking up one of the blotters, he discovered that, while the top sheet was practically clean, the old used sheets of blotting paper had been left underneath. Rapidly he examined every sheet. On several he saw marks of Carter Woodman's writing and of his large, bold signature. This, however, showed only that Woodman often used the room. So far it bore out his story. The pads bore impressions of several other handwritings, but only one other recurred frequently. Ellery was able to make out the signature by holding the paper up to the light. The writing was curious and quite unmistakable. The name of the writer was Ba Pu, evidently an Oriental. Ellery had an idea. It was a chance and no more, but he made up his mind to see Ba Pu if he was still in the hotel and to put a few questions. Returning to the hall, he asked the porter the number of his room. "Oh, you mean the Burmese gentleman," said the porter. "He has a suite on the first floor. His sitting room is number 17. He came in only a few minutes ago." Ellery made his way to number 17 and knocked. The Burmese, a small, dark-skinned man with curious, twinkling little eyes and quick movements, was in his room and received him with ready courtesy. Ellery presented his card and apologized for intruding upon him. "Oh, no," said the Burmese. "You not intrude. Very pleased." "You may think it very strange of me," said Ellery. "But may I ask you a question without explaining fully why I ask it? It is on a matter of real importance." "Ask, yes," said the Burmese. "I help if I can." He spoke English quickly and jerkily, but he evidently understood the language well. "I very glad meet you, Mr. Ellery. I Burmese, come here study the British conditions. Go back Burma, tell my people all about this country. You help me, I help you." "Then that's a bargain, and I can ask you my question at once. Did you use the writing room opposite here at any time on the evening of Tuesday, the 17th of this month?" "Why, that the day I came here. Yes, I used them that night. I came here study your conditions. I want meet all your famous men. I go there, write letters, ask them meet me. I write your Mr. Bernard Shaw, your Mr. Wells, your Mr. Arnold Bennett." Ellery interrupted. "Can you tell me at what time that evening you were in the writing room?" "Yes, I tell you. I come here to stay. Evening I wish write letters. I wish at once to meet your famous men. I go to writing room door. I peep in. I see gentleman there writing. He not notice me, but I shy. I steal away." "What time was that?" 11 by the clock. "No, earlier. It was what you call 11 less a quarter." "I see, about 10:45. Yes, I go back to my room and I wait. I leave door open, and soon I see gentlemen come out of writing room and go downstairs. Then I go in. I write my letters." "Do you know when that was?" "I go back to writing room a few minutes after I go back to my room. About 11 of the clock. It was then." "And how long did you stay there?" "I stay there long time. What you call the 3/4 of hour, perhaps." "And then you came back to your room?" "Yes, I come back here." "You did not see the gentleman who was in the writing room again?" "Yes, I see him. He come upstairs there, outside my door, just after I got back to my room." "You left the door open then?" "Yes, there was no air. It is what you call stuffy here. I see him go into writing room." "And that was the last you saw of him?" "Yes, but he stay in hotel. I see him later, days later, oftentimes." "Then you would recognize him if you saw him? Is this he?" And Ellery passed a photograph of Carter Woodman to the Burmese. "Yes, that he." And then the Burmese smiled blandly and added, "And now you tell me why you wish to know this." "I would rather not tell you just yet, Mr. Pooh, if you will forgive me. All I can say is that what you have told me affects a man's life." "You not want to tell me, you not tell me. but you help me get interview with Mr. Bernard Shaw. I help you. You help me, see? Ellery promised his good offices for what they were worth. And Mr. H.G. Wells? Ellery again promised with rather more hesitation to do what he could. And Mr. Bennet? This time Ellery, foreseeing further additions to the list, suggested that he should come back and have another talk with Mr. Pooh in a day or two. He would certainly do anything possible to help him. And Mr. Bertrand Russell? The Burmese was saying as Ellery managed to talk himself out of the room. Here at last, Ellery said to himself, as he left the hotel, was proof positive, even all but certainty. Woodman had lied about his doings on Tuesday evening, and his alibi was a fake. At the time when he had said that he was writing letters in the small writing room, he was really somewhere else. He had left the writing room at a few minutes before 11, and he had only returned to it by the stairs which led directly to the basement about 3/4 of an hour later. The inference was obvious, to Ellery at least. But his new certainty that Woodman was a criminal was still, of course, very far from complete demonstration. A man might lie about his movements and still not be a murderer. What should the next step be? He would see John and convince her now that his suspicions had been rightly directed. She could hardly still doubt. The end of chapter 29. Chapter 30 of the Brooklyn Murders. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganandh. The Brooklyn Murders by G.D.H. Cole. Chapter 30. A Letter and Its Consequences. One of John's duties during these troublous days was to deal with Sir Vernon's private letters. The management of the Brooklyn Corporation had passed, for the time being, into the hands of a subordinate, but there were many private letters to be read and answered. Ill as he was, Sir Vernon liked to be consulted about some of these, and John always set aside a few to discuss with him each morning. On the day following Ellery's successful investigation at the Cunningham Hotel, John sat opening the letters at breakfast. Most of them contained little of interest, but there was one marked private which was clearly of importance. As John read it, she felt that yet another of the clues leading to the discovery of the murderer had come unexpectedly into her hands. The letter was from Sir John Bunnery, the successful solicitor well known in the sporting world as a bookmaker's attorney, a nickname which he had earned by his long association with legal cases connected with the turf. Sir John had been a friend of Sir Vernon's in earlier years, but the two men had quarrelled many years ago, and since then they had seen nothing of each other. Carter Woodman, however, was, as Joan knew, a friend of Sir John's, and she was not surprised when, glancing down the letter, she read his name. Sir John Bunnery began by offering his sympathy to an old friend in the misfortunes which had come upon him, adding that he hoped their drifting apart of late years would not make the sympathy less welcome. Then, having said the proper things, he came to business. On the previous day, he explained, a somewhat curious request had come to him from Mr. Carter Woodman, who had asked for his help in securing a large loan, stating that there could be no doubt about the repayment of the money, as full security could be given that far more than the sum asked for would be available under the will of Sir Vernon Brooklyn. He, Carter Woodman, was one of the beneficiaries under the will, and he was also in a position to offer, in return for the loan, the joint guarantee of Mr. Walter Brooklyn, who had now, in tragic circumstances, become the principal beneficiary under the will. Woodman stated that he was Walter Brooklyn's heir, and that he and Walter were prepared to make themselves jointly liable for the repayment of the sum asked for. Sir John said that he would, of course, be most pleased to assist Mr. Woodman, who was a personal friend. But although Woodman had approached him in confidence and asked him not to mention the matter even to Sir Vernon, he had felt it necessary to write equally in confidence to Sir Vernon in order to ascertain whether Woodman and Walter Brooklyn were in fact the heirs. Sir Vernon would understand that he was asking for this information only in strict confidence, and he, Sir John, would quite accept the position if the answer was that Sir Vernon did not feel able to tell him how matters stood. In that case, however, he would feel compelled to decline to arrange the very large advance, £60,000, for which Woodman had asked. A hint would be enough to tell him how he ought to act. Sir John ended with a repetition of his condolences and expressed the hope that when Sir Vernon was well enough, their old friendship might be renewed. John read the letter right through with a feeling of bewilderment. What could it all mean? Were her stepfather and Carter Woodman really acting in collusion in an attempt to raise money in anticipation of Sir Vernon's death? And if they were, what light did their extraordinary proceeding throw on the murders? The letter gave Joan a good deal to think about. The information which Woodman had given to Sir John Bunnery might of course be technically correct. She realized that, under the existing will, Walter Brooklyn was, now that the two persons who had stood in his way had been removed, the principal beneficiary. But he had become so entirely by an accident, which was certainly no part of the testator's intention, and his chance of remaining so depended entirely on Sir Vernon's not making a new will in someone else's favour. Woodman, of course, might have a good reason for thinking that he would not do that, even if he were able, but John doubted this, and was more inclined to believe that he was relying on Sir Vernon's speedy death without making a new will. Walter had in any case only became the heir after the murders. That was but a few days ago, and he and Woodman had, Joan reflected, certainly been quite extraordinarily prompt in trying to take advantage of the new position. Either they must be in some terrible financial difficulty, or they must fear the making of a new will and hope to raise the money before this could come about. What surprised Joan far more were the statements that Walter had made Carter Woodman his heir. She knew well that Walter had no love for Woodman, and she at once realized that he could only have taken such a step in return for a pecuniary consideration. There was obviously in Woodman's application to Sir John Bunnery evidence of a very unpleasant bargain. The whole letter made Joan very angry indeed. In any case, the receipt of the letter could not but considerably strengthen Joan's suspicions of Carter Woodman. Of course, she said to herself, he hoped to raise this money without her hearing anything about it, and she could not help feeling that it looked very much as if he had deliberately planned the whole thing in order to lay hands on the money. But apart from the effect of the letter upon Joan, what was likely to be its effect on Sir Vernon? She felt that she must show it to him, and she did not conceal from herself that she positively wanted him to see it. For she hardly concealed from herself now her desire, a hope for Ellery's sake, that Sir Vernon would alter his will. The effect of Sir John Bunnery's letter, she thought, would certainly be to make him very angry with both Walter Brooklyn and Carter Woodman, and she felt sure that, ill as he was, Sir Vernon, under the circumstances, would lose no time in making a new will. Woodman, indeed, had, she felt, effectively destroyed his chances of getting the money, for the sake of which, if her suspicions were correct, he had probably done 2 men to death. Sir John Bunnery's breach of confidence had hoisted the engineer with his own petard. Taking this letter and 1 or 2 others from the heap which lay before her, Joan went up to Sir Vernon's room. She read him the others first and received his instructions, or rather his permission to deal with them as she thought best. Then, without any previous comment, she read him Sir John Bunnery's letter, watching his face as she read. The effect of the news upon him was exactly what she had expected. He was very angry, and while she was reading, he interjected indignant comments. He was effectively roused, and as soon as she had finished reading, he bade her write at once to Sir John Bunnery, not answering his question directly, but strongly advising him not to lend the money. "Write at once," he said, "and I'll sign it myself. The answer must be sent immediately." Joan needed no second invitation. She sat down at once, and having written the answer, read it through to Sir Vernon, who signed it. She then gave it to one of the servants, with instructions that it should be posted immediately. When she came back into the room, Sir Vernon was sitting up in bed. He had a pencil in his hand and was trying to write on the fly-leaf of a book he had taken from the table beside his bed. As Joan came in, he sank back, exhausted by the effort. "Come here, my dear," he said. "I shan't rest now till I've made a new will, and I want you to write it for me. It can be put into proper legal form later, if there is time." "Shall I send for Carter Woodman?" said Joan. "No, my dear, no more Carter Woodman for me just now. I shall have to find a new lawyer, but never mind that now. You write what I tell you." Then, slowly and painfully, the old man dictated a new will. "I have to make it simple," he said. The new will left Joan the whole of his fortune, with the request that she should pay to all persons mentioned in the previous will and still living the sums there left to them, except that no sum should be paid to Carter Woodman. A further clause appointed John and Henry Lucas joint executors, and a third, an afterthought, provided for the payment of a small annuity to Helen Woodman. "There is no need for her to suffer for what he has done," said Sir Vernon. 2 of the servants were then called in to witness the will, and John, at Sir Vernon's command, took it downstairs and had it placed at once in the office safe of the Brooklyn Corporation. "I'm easier now in my mind," said the old man, as John returned from her errand. "You will have to carry on the Brooklyn tradition now, John," he added. John took his hand and sat by him, and in a few minutes he fell asleep. John sat up by his side for a while. Then she quietly disengaged her hand and left him sleeping. He was tired out, but she believed the exertion had done him good. In the lounge, John found Ellery in a high state of excitement. "News, darling," he said. "I've news for you, and it shows that I was right." "I have some news for you too, my boy. It's a most extraordinary thing that has happened. I'm not so sure as I was that you were wrong. I think my news makes it simply certain I was right. Bob, Sir Vernon has made a new will, cutting out Carter." "My dear, you don't mean to say he suspects?" "No, of course he doesn't. But this morning we found out that Carter and my stepfather are trying, the 2 of them, to raise money on the strength of the will." "Good God! How did you find out that?" "A letter came to Sir Vernon from Sir John Bunnery, saying Woodman had approached him in confidence for a loan of £60,000 on the joint security of his and my stepfather's expectations. He said my stepfather had made him his heir." "Made whom?" "Why, Carter, so that he stood to get the money anyway." Ellery whistled. "My word, the plot thickens. And now let me tell you my news." And so the 2 lovers exchanged the information. Joan, in her anger against Carter Woodman, was now a good deal easier to convince. She admitted at once the force of Ellery's evidence. If Woodman had lied, it was not likely that he had lied for nothing. Her anger for the time prevented her from realizing the full horror of the position, but presently it came home to her. "Oh, poor Helen," she said. "What are we to do? It'll break her heart. My dear, we must clear this thing up now. We can't leave it where it stands. You see that?" Joan pulled herself together. "Yes, I suppose we have to go through with it." "And find positive proof." "I suppose we must go on." "We can't prove it yet, you see," said Ellery. "But we have made a really good beginning on the job of bringing last Tuesday's business home to Woodman, and we mustn't lose any time in following up that trail to the end." "But how do you suppose to follow it up? Haven't you done all you can there?" "No. Don't you see? We must prove that the man the servants took for George that night when he went out of this house was really Carter Woodman." "That all sounds very well, but I don't see how you're going to do it." "Neither do I, but I mean to have a shot." "My dear Bob, let me try. It's my turn to do something. I have an idea, and I may be able to find out about it." "You're very mysterious. Won't you tell me what the idea is?" "No, Bob. It may come to nothing, and I'd rather try it myself first. It won't take long to find out. You've done all the clever things so far, and I think it's my turn for a change." "Right you are, John. I only hope it's a good one." "I hope it is, but it is only a chance. You come back here tonight and I'll tell you. Besides, I want an excuse for seeing you again." "Darling," said Ellery, and the conversation for the next few minutes can be left to the experienced imagination of the reader. The end of chapter 30. Chapter 31 of the Brooklyn Murders by G.D.H. Cole. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganandh. The Brooklyn Murders by G.D.H. Cole. Chapter 31. A Button in a Bag. As soon as Ellery had gone, Joan put on her things and walked across to the Cunningham Hotel, where she went straight upstairs to the rooms occupied by Carter Woodman and his wife. As she expected, there was no one at home. Woodman was at his office, and Marian Brooklyn and Mrs. Woodman were, she knew, away for the day. Joan locked the 2 doors opening on the corridor and had the suite safely to herself. It would have been awkward if anyone had interrupted her, for what she did was to make a thorough search of the rooms, looking particularly at all the articles of male clothing and going very carefully through Carter Woodman's own belongings. Her search was entirely unsuccessful, and having replaced everything neatly so that no one would notice that it had been disturbed, she unlocked the door and gave it up as a bad job. "So much for that little idea," she said to herself. "I could never really have hoped to find it there." But was that the end of her idea? As Joan finished her tidying up, she began to hope that it was not. Carter Woodman has not been foolish enough to leave what she was looking for in his own rooms. But he must, she said to herself, have left it somewhere. Where then would he have left it? Where would she, if she wanted to get safely rid of a rather bulky object so as never to hear of it again, be likely to leave it? A station cloakroom at once occurred to her as a likely place, but the prospect of searching all the cloakrooms of London was not alluring. Moreover, there were a dozen other places in which he might have disposed of a compromising object with almost equal safety. At the bottom of the river, a stone was all that was needed. In a pawn shop, of course, after removing all marks that would serve to identify the article. In a cab, or any of 100 other places merely by leaving them behind. The cabman would hardly ask questions if he found something of obvious value. To hunt for what Woodman had hidden seemed far more hopeless, far worse than looking for a needle in a haystack. It would need an army of men to do the searching. The police might be able to do that sort of thing. She and Ellery certainly could not. Yet, if their theory was right, Woodman had almost certainly returned to the hotel after murdering George and Princep, bearing with him at least one very compromising piece of property. He could hardly have got rid of it, or them, safely the same evening. Most likely he would have done them up in a bag or parcel and gone out to dispose of them the next morning on his way to his office. A bag was the more likely, for as Woodman habitually carried one, it would attract less notice than a parcel. Assume that he had gone out with the things in a bag. Had he taken them to his office, or had he got rid of them on the way? Either might be the case, and it would not be easy to follow up the clue. Then Joan had a sudden thought. Swiftly she got up and again locked the doors. Among the things she had searched, there had been a large handbag. She had looked into it and found it empty. As the objects she was seeking were bulky, she had not studied it very carefully, but it was just possible that it might repay further inspection. But before Joan could make her search, she heard steps coming along the corridor. Hastily she unlocked the sitting-room door and hurried into the bedroom. Hardly had she done so when she saw Carter Woodman come into the room. Fortunately, the bedroom communicated directly with the corridor, and Joan, without pausing to make any further examination or to watch Woodman's movements, let herself out noiselessly into the corridor and sped down the stairs unobserved. A narrow shave, and all it seemed for nothing. Then Woodman's presence in the hotel gave Joan another idea. If he was there, he was not at his office. Why should she not complete the task she had set herself by having a look round there as well? She took a taxi, and in less than a quarter of an hour she was in Woodman's outer office and in talk with his confidential clerk. She was told that Woodman was not in and would not be back until after lunch. She told Mooman that she could not wait, but that she would like to go into the inner office and write a note. Mooman at once showed her in and withdrew to the outer room. Joan saw that whatever she did, she would have to do quickly. First, she scribbled a hasty note stating that he had come to see Woodman to inquire about her stepfather's affairs. As he was out, however, her business would keep. Having done this, she cast her eyes quickly round the room. In one corner was a hat and coat cupboard, and in it was hanging a coat of Woodman's. Very quickly she went through the pockets. The only papers were a number of restaurant bills, evidently stuffed in hastily and forgotten. Joan confiscated them, without much hope that they would be of use. Then in the bottom of the cupboard she noticed a handbag, twin brother of the one she had been on the point of examining at the hotel. Hastily she opened it. Apparently it was empty, but feeling round the corners, Joan found a hard object, a coat button, which she quickly transferred to her purse. Then putting back the bag and closing the cupboard, she returned to the outer room. A talk with the clerk might have its uses. "Mr. Woodman has been looking rather ill just lately," Joan began. "Do you think he is really unwell?" "I must say, miss, he is not well. Between you and me, miss, he's been badly worried." "About these terrible murders, you mean?" "About them, miss, and about other things. Mr. Woodman wouldn't like my saying so, but he has had terrible worries." "Oh dear, I hope nothing serious." "Oh, probably not, miss, and you mustn't say a word about it to anyone. I ought not to have said what I did say, but I'm worried too. You'll be sure not to mention it, miss, won't you? All right, Moomin. Don't you worry. But, miss, Mr. Woodman is such a short-tempered gentleman, and you don't know how angry he'd be if he knew what I have been saying to you. You'll have to look after him, Moomin. See that he doesn't worry too much. By the way, I suppose I couldn't catch him now at lunch. Where does he usually lunch? Generally at the Blue Boar up Holborn, miss. He generally goes to Blue Boar every day when he's in this part. If I try there and don't find him, where else could I try? Does he ever go to any other restaurant? I don't quite know where he'd be, miss. One day last week he went to the Avenue by Hatton Garden, but I don't think he's been there since. He's never been there but the once to my knowledge. When was that, Moomin? As it happens, miss, I can tell you. It was the day we heard of those terrible murders. Last Wednesday, miss. Thank you, Moomin. I'll see if he's at either of these places. If not, I may come back. But Joan did not go to either of the places of which Moomin had told her. Instead, she went to the nearest telephone box and phoned to Ellery, who was lunching at his club, to come at once and meet her outside Chancery Lane station. Meanwhile, she went into an ABC and ordered a cup of coffee. As she waited, she took out the coat button and had a good look at it. She was not in much doubt. The button was of a quite peculiar type, a bright brass button identical with those which George Brooklyn always wore on his summer evening coat. Here was luck indeed. According to her theory, Carter Woodman had been mistaken for George Brooklyn because he had deliberately come out of Liskeet House wearing George's coat and opera hat. George was very particular with his dress, and the coat was quite unmistakable. And with these, if not in them, he must have returned to the Cunningham Hotel, where he would have stowed them away somewhere safely for the night. But the next morning his first object would be to get rid of their incriminating presence. She had guessed that he would pack them away in the bag which he usually carried, and so leave for the office bearing them away without any risk of arousing suspicion. Then her first thought had been that he would leave them in some railway cloakroom or drop them quietly into the river. But this would involve the risk that the bag might turn up and be identified as his. What would be the safest way of disposing the hat and coat without leaving the bag or running any risk of identification? She thought she had guessed at least one way in which it might have been done, and it was to follow this up that she wanted Ellery's help. She had now proved definitely to her own satisfaction that the coat had been in Woodman's bag, but she was not sure whether the police would be willing to accept the evidence of a solitary coat button. They must find the coat, unless it had been put beyond reach of recovery. When Ellery arrived, Joan told him that they were going to lunch together at the Avenue restaurant opposite Hatton Garden. In a few words, she told him what he was to do. At the Avenue, Joan remained at the table they had chosen, while Ellery went to the gentleman's cloakroom. There was no attendant in the room at the time, and Ellery made a quick survey of the 2 or 3 dozen hats and coats which were hanging there. What he was looking for was at any rate not among them. In a few minutes the attendant came in, and Ellery entered into talk. "Do you get many hats and coats left behind here?" he asked. "Not many, sir. Sometimes a gentleman leaves a coat or an umbrella, but he generally comes back for it. Gentlemen sometimes leave things when they are a bit torn, sir, if I may put it so without taking a liberty. But not often, sir. Most of the customers here are very regular gents. When things is left, we keep them here for a week or 2, and then we send them to the lost property office. Have you lost something, sir?" "No, but a friend of mine thinks he left a coat and opera hat here a week or so ago. Have you found anything of the sort?" "Yes, I have," said the porter. "And what's more, I'm damned, sir, begging your pardon, sir, if I could make it out at all. Gentlemen don't usually walk about in opera hats at lunchtime, or go away leaving their hats behind. But this lot was left at lunchtime. I know that, sir, because it weren't here in the morning, and I noticed it after lunch. Perhaps it had my friend's name in it. No, sir, that it didn't. I searched that coat, and not a name nor a scrap of paper was there on it. A pair of gloves and a few coppers was all it had in it. Wasn't there a name in the hat either?" "No, there wasn't, or we would probably have found the owner by now." "Well," said Ellery, "I'm going to take you into my confidence. I believe that coat and hat did belong to my friend, and I want you to let me have a look at them. The matter is more important than it sounds, for if it is a coat, I think it may be the clue to the discovery of a murderer." "Lord, sir, you don't say so." The attendant's face brightened, and a new sense of importance came into his manner. "Lord, a real murderer!" He rubbed his hands. Then he said, remembering that he had no idea who Ellery might be, "In that case, sir, ought not we to send for the police?" "All in good time," said Ellery, "but before we do that, you must let me see the coat and hat and find out if I am right. It wouldn't do to bring the police here on a wild goose chase. I don't want to take them away. But you must keep them safe and not give them up to anyone until the police come." The porter thereupon brought out the coat and hat. The coat was undoubtedly George Brooklyn's, or own fellow to his, and to make the proof complete, there was a button missing, and the remaining buttons were the same as that which Joan had found in the handbag in Carter Woodman's office. Ellery turned to examine the hat. There was no name in it, but in the crown there was evidence no less valuable. At some time the adhesive gold initials which hatters use had been fastened inside. These had been removed or fallen out, but their removal had left the spaces which they had covered cleaner than the rest of the white silk lining. The initials G.B. stood out, not as plainly as if the gold letters had remained, but quite unmistakably when the lining was carefully examined. There could be no doubt that Joan's sagacity had resulted in bringing to light George Brooklyn's hat and coat, or that they had been left in a place which Woodman had visited on the day following the murder. Their theory that Woodman had masqueraded as George Brooklyn was confirmed, and the new evidence served to connect him more closely than any previous discovery with the murders at Liskeard House. Ellery drew Woodman's photograph from his pocket. "Have you ever seen this gentleman?" he asked, but the porter did not remember. He might have, or he might not. So many gentlemen come to the avenue, and he was not continuously in the cloakroom. The lady at the cash desk would be more likely to remember. She was a rare one for faces. Cautioning the man to take the greatest care of the hat and coat until the police came, Ellery rejoined Joan in the restaurant upstairs and told her of his success. They determined to see the manager and take further precautions against the disappearance of George Brooklyn's clothes. Joan had selected a table in an alcove at which it was possible to talk quietly without being overheard, and through the head waiter, Ellery got the manager to come and join them there. They told him in confidence the greater part of the story, names and all, except that they did not give Carter Woodman's name. The manager promised that the coat and hat should be kept safely and given up only to the police. He then sent for the cashier to whom Woodman's photograph was shown. But she did not remember his face and was inclined to be positive that he had not really lunched there on that day. The waiters were then called in turn and shown the photograph, but none of them remembered having seen Woodman. The manager seemed to regard this as conclusive evidence that he had not lunched in the restaurant. "Of course," said Ellery, "he may have lunched here and not been noticed, but I am inclined to believe he didn't lunch here at all. There was nothing to stop him from walking straight into the cloakroom and then going right away as if he had lunched without coming into the restaurant at all. I wonder how Mooman knew he lunched here that day." "We can't ask him that without putting him on his guard," said Joan. "But what we have is good enough, and we can make Mooman speak out later if it becomes necessary." The manager had by this time left them, and they were discussing the situation alone. Suddenly Ellery broke in on something that Joan was saying. "By Jove," he said, "I've just remembered. What a fool I'm not to have thought of it before." "What is it this time?" "Why, you remember those fingerprints of Princeps that were on the club George was killed with? I know how they got there. When we were in the garden before dinner, I saw Princep take down that club from the statue and swing it about. He was showing it to... whom do you think?" "Not Carter Woodman?" "Yes, Woodman. That must have given him the idea of using the club. He may have remembered that it would probably have Princep's finger marks on it." "Yes, but if he used it afterwards, it would have his marks too." "Not necessarily. Don't you remember the police saying at the inquest that some of the marks were blurred, as if the club had been handled afterwards? That inspector fellow said he was sure the murderer had worn gloves." "That is it. Woodman must have worn gloves, and they blurred the marks. That shows that Woodman killed George as well as Princep. Of course it all helps to make it likely, and I never thought John had done it. But it's not proof, you know." "It may not be proof, but by George, with the rest of the facts we have, I think it's good enough." "No, Bob, I don't think it's good enough. For proof, I mean. Unless we can prove that Carter was in Liskeard House that evening. If we could prove that, I agree that we could bring the whole thing home to him. But we know he went out of Cunningham and lied about where he had been. We know he lied, but we can't prove that he went out of the hotel. We've only showed that he could have gone out and in again without being seen. It really isn't good enough yet." But how are we to make it any better? If Carter got back into Liskey's house, I'm going to find out how he did it. He couldn't have come in by the front door. Someone would have been certain to see him. And I'm fairly certain he couldn't have got in through the theatre without being seen. Then how on earth did he get in? That's what I mean to find out. If he didn't come in the other ways, he must have come in through the courtyard. But surely the evidence at the inquest showed that it was all locked up and no one could possibly have got in that way. My dear Bob, the evidence only showed that it was locked at 11 o'clock. The police theory was that the murders were somewhere between midnight. But we believe Carter got out of the Cunninghams sometime before 11. He must have come there before it was locked, and we know now, thanks to the coat button, how he got out. You may be right, but the chauffeur and his wife both said they didn't see anyone come in before they locked up. So that, even if Woodman did come that way, I don't see how we can prove it. You are a Jeremiah. Of course, I don't see either. But I haven't really tried yet, and I'm going to. And now, Bob, let's pay a bill and get to work on it. It must be so, and I'm not going to believe it can't be proved. The end of chapter 31. Chapter 32 of the Brooklyn Murders. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganandh. The Brooklyn Murders by G.D.H. Cole. Chapter 32. Sir John Bunnery. Before John and Ellery parted, they arranged what each should do next to clear up the remaining difficulties. John was to test a theory about the courtyard, while Ellery was to investigate the circumstances surrounding the extraordinary attempt of Woodman and Walter Brooklyn to raise a loan in anticipation of Sir Vernon's death. Woodman had approached Sir John Bunnery, and Sir John's subsequent letter to Sir Vernon seemed to make it worthwhile to find out what information he possessed. Ellery made up his mind to go and see Sir John, and John furnished him with a convenient pretext for doing so. Sir Vernon had determined to get his new will into proper legal form at the earliest possible moment, and had told John that Woodman must on no account be allowed to do the drafting of it. She had suggested that Sir John Bunnery might be called in, and Sir Vernon had readily agreed. John therefore commissioned Ellery to call on Sir John and asked him to come to Liskey's house at his earliest convenience for the purpose of drawing up Sir Vernon's new will. Ellery wrote on his card, "From Sir Vernon Brooklyn," and aided by the name, was speedily shown into Sir John Bunnery's private office. Sir John was not at all the popular idea of what the bookmaker's attorney ought to be. He was a small, dried-up old man with very sharp little eyes that darted to and fro with disconcerting suddenness. He had a way of sitting very still and looking his visitors up and down with those bright little eyes until they felt that no detail of their appearance and perhaps none of their thoughts had escaped observation. Sir John made Ellery nervous, and after a few sentences he found that he had completed his ostensible business without getting anywhere near the matter he had really come to discuss. He shifted uneasily in his chair. Sir John Bunnery evidently read his thoughts. "And now, young man, there is something else you want to say to me, isn't there?" This was not at all the way in which Ellery had expected to conduct the interview. He had hoped to discover what he wanted casually in the course of conversation without giving Sir John, who was, after all, a friend of Woodman's, any hint of what he wanted to know. But Sir John was manifestly a man whom it was not easy to pump. Ellery was wondering what to reply when the old lawyer spoke again. "I have refused Woodman that advance. Is that what you wanted to know?" Ellery said that it was not, and then realized that he had admitted wanting to know something. "Well, what is it then?" said Sir John. There was nothing for it but either to get out of the room without the information that was needed, or to make Sir John Bunnery, at least in part, a confidant. Ellery rapidly chose the latter course and elected to go to work the most direct way. "I want to know precisely what Carter Woodman said to you when he asked you to lend him that money. Do you know what he wanted it for?" "You want to know a lot, young man. And why should I tell you all this?" "Because Carter Woodman is a murderer." Those small eyes looked at him very suddenly. Said Sir John. "And so you think Woodman killed those two fellows at Liskey's house? Is that it, eh? I dare say they were a good riddance." "I must say you take it very calmly, Sir John." "In my business, young man, we get used to taking things calmly. Murder is not an uncommon crime." "But I understood Carter Woodman was a friend of yours." If you were my age, young man, and in my profession, you wouldn't be surprised even if one of your friends committed a murder. But he is no friend of mine now. Carter Woodman would be a good riddance himself. I could have put him in prison for trying to raise money on false pretenses. Sir John, you will tell me what you know. I have almost certain proof that Woodman did commit murder. But your evidence may be indispensable. In that case, I should naturally give it at the proper time to the police. Why should I give it to you, young man? I never heard of you before. Who are you? Only a friend of Sir Vernon's and of Miss Cooper's. You probably know my guardian, Mr. Lucas. Miss Cooper and I have been working on the case together. Oh, you have you? Playing the amateur detective, eh? We have found out any amount the police don't know anyhow. Yes, amateur detectives always do, in the novels. I prefer to say what I have to say at the proper time to the police. It saves complications. But Sir John, the police are absolutely wrong about this. If you will tell me what you know, I will undertake that the police shall be fully informed within the next few days. And why not now, young man? Because you want to do it all yourself. Is that it? Perhaps it is. And perhaps it isn't, Sir John. But you know best. Let's telephone to the police to send someone round here. And you can tell them and me together. And have the police worrying round here all day till heaven knows when? No, thank you, young man. Sir John paused, and then went on suddenly. I suppose you are going to marry that Cooper girl? I don't think that's any business of yours, Sir John, but I have no objection to telling you that we are engaged to be married. Tut, tut, don't lose your temper, boy. I'm just going to tell you all about it. Woodman came to see me the other night at my club. No, not the Byron. Foster's, at the corner of Clarges Street. That was at 9 o'clock by my appointment. He was with me for an hour, discussing that loan you seem to know all about. He told me just what I told Sir Vernon in my letter, that Walter Brooklyn had made a will in his favour, and that they were prepared to sign their joint names to a bill. He said that made the loan perfectly safe, on the strength of their expectations from Sir Vernon. That was all he told me. Sir John stopped. Is that all you know? Asked Ellery with an air of disappointment. No, of course it's not all. You just wait a minute, young man. Don't be impatient. Sir John glared for a few seconds at his visitor and then continued. I may say that Woodman already owed me a considerable sum in connection with a business transaction. So I thought it wise to make a few inquiries about him in the city. And I may tell you, young man, that the fellow is bankrupt. Positively bankrupt. A shilling in the pound affair, or something like it. Speculation, of course. He can't hold out for more than a few days. There are men on the stock exchange who know that for a fact. So that Woodman would be very likely to take some desperate step in order to retrieve his fortunes, such as coming to me and trying to raise money under false pretenses. The man's a damn scoundrel, said Sir John. Surely murder is worse than raising money on false pretenses, Sir John. Oh, is it, young man? Of course, you know all about it. I only know that the fellow ought to be locked up. That's enough for me. I might have lent him the money as a friend. But surely, Sir John, when you found out all this about him, you wouldn't have considered lending him the money. Of course I did not consider it. Not for a moment. I never meant to lend him another penny. I wrote that letter of mine simply to put Sir Vernon on his guard. I would have gone to the police, but as I told you, I saw no reason why I should get myself mixed up in the affair. But it would have outraged my legal sense if that man had got Sir Vernon's money by means of some jiggery-pokery with that old scoundrel Walter Brooklyn. So I wrote to Sir Vernon. You see my position? If that's your position, I don't quite see why you are telling me all this now. I am telling you, young man, because I had no suspicion that he had committed murder as well. If that is the case, a man of that sort is too dangerous to be left loose. He might be murdering me next, or Sir Vernon. But now you're going to tell me all about your case against him. Ellery saw that it was best to tell the whole story, and he did tell most of it. Sir John listened, only interrupting every now and then with a pertinent question. At the end, his only comment was, not so bad for amateurs. And now, my fine young man, what are you going to do next? If I am to be the family lawyer, that is a point which concerns me. Is it to be a first-class family scandal, eh? Really, we have been so busy trying to discover the truth that I don't think we have ever considered what to do afterwards. But you will have to consider it now. Do you think Sir Vernon is anxious to have another scandal in the family? If you do, I don't. I suppose the murderer will have to be brought to justice. You do you? And doubtless you look forward to appearing in court and showing how clever you have been? Really, Sir John, I look forward to nothing of the kind. If Carter Woodman could be put out of the way of further mischief without dragging the whole affair into court, I should ask for nothing better. How much of what you have found out is known to the police? Nothing at all, I believe. Of course, some other people, the manager at the Avenue, for example, know something of the story. They can be dealt with. Well, young man, you think it over and come back and talk to me before you say a word to the police. Bring your Miss Cooper too, if you like. I'm told she's a pretty girl. And with those words, the old lawyer held out his hand and bustled his visitor out of the office. Ellery left Sir John Bunnery's presence feeling as if he had been bruised all over. He had found out what he wanted, but not at all in the way he had intended. And now this masterful old man apparently meant to take full command of the case. He must see Joan and tell her what had happened. The end of chapter 32. Chapter 33 of the Brooklyn Murders. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganandh. The Brooklyn Murders by G.D.H. Cole. Chapter 33. On the Tiles. Inspector Blaikie had received very definite instructions from the superintendent as to the course of investigation which he was to follow up. He was to find out all he could about Woodman's financial circumstances, and he was to seek for proof that Woodman had been in possession of Walter Brooklyn's walking stick. Side by side with this line of investigation, he had intended to look further into his private suspicions of Ellery, but these, which had been almost removed by his last talk with the superintendent, were finally dispelled by a further talk with William Gloucester. Ellery's alibi was good enough. Carter Woodman was a man whose every concern he must scrutinize if he would find the murderer. It did not take the inspector long to prove beyond doubt that Woodman was in a state of serious financial embarrassment. Discreet inquiries in the city showed that he had been speculating heavily in oil shares and that he stood to lose a large sum on the falling prices of the shares which he had contracted to buy. There was nothing to show directly that he had staked his clients as well as his own money on the fate of his dealings, but the inspector could make a shrewd guess at the state of his affairs. In all probability, he must either raise money at once or else face ignominious collapse and perhaps worse. It was definite that he had been putting off his creditors with promises to pay in the near future and plunging meanwhile into most serious difficulties in the attempt to extricate himself. So far, so good. But the other matter gave the inspector far more serious trouble. Try as he would, he could get no clue that would tell him whether Walter Brooklyn had really left his walking stick in Carter Woodman's office. His first thought had been to see Woodman's confidential clerk and to find out, if possible, without putting Woodman on his guard, what the man might know. He had scraped an acquaintance with Mooman in the course of his investigations and had several times talked to him about the case. Mooman, he was fairly well convinced, had not the least suspicion of his employer's guilt, and the inspector was sure that he had said nothing to make him suspect. Indeed, he could hardly have done so, for only since he last saw the man had he himself begun to suspect Woodman. Now, accordingly, Inspector Blaikie, watching for an opportunity when he was certain that Carter Woodman was not in his office, went to see Mooman. He asked for Woodman, and receiving the answer that he was out, fell easily into conversation with the old clerk. It was quite casually that he asked after a while, "By the way, Walter Brooklyn was here on the day of the murders. You don't happen to remember whether he had his walking stick with him, do you?" Mooman looked at him sharply, as if he realized that there was a purpose in the question. "I have no idea," he said. "It isn't a thing I should notice one way or the other. I'm too short-sighted to notice much." The inspector tried a little to jog his memory, but with no result. Mooman either did not remember, or he would not tell. To ask the young clerk in the vestibule seemed too dangerous, for to do so would almost certainly be to put Woodman on his guard. The inspector could only report to the superintendent that he had failed to trace his stick. "Look here, Blaikie," said Superintendent Wilson, "this will never do. We know perfectly well who committed these murders, and we are as far off bringing it home to him as ever. The inspector could only reply that he had done his best. "Yes, and I'm not blaming you," his superior rejoined. "But it won't do. I see I shall have to take a hand in the game myself. We must find out about the walking stick, and there's another point I've reasoned out today. Where's the weapon with which Princep was killed?" "Why, you have got the club." Yes, but you don't tell me that the murderer carried that immense unwieldy thing up 2 flights of stairs when he might easily have been seen." "No, Princep wasn't killed with that club. George Brooklyn was, but it was some other weapon that killed Princep." "There's a knife," suggested the inspector. "But you have that too." "Really, Inspector, you are unusually thick-headed this morning. The man wasn't killed with a knife. He was killed with a blow on the back of the head delivered with some heavy blunt instrument. Isn't that what the doctor said?" "Quite. If it wasn't the club, I suppose the murderer carried the weapon away." "I suppose he may have done, as you did not find it." "You're sure there was no object in the room that might have been used as a weapon?" "None at all, sir, I think. The stick belonging to Walter Brooklyn could not have made the wound, I am told, nor any of the other sticks for that matter. It looks much more like a case of sandbagging, now I think of it in this light." "Well, Inspector, I am not satisfied, and I feel sure you will not object if I do a bit of investigation on my own." "Are you taking the case out of my hands, sir?" No, I want you to carry on, and especially to find out what these young people, Miss Cooper and Ellery, are doing. There are only 2 or 3 points on which I want to satisfy myself personally." "Very well, sir," said the inspector, and he left feeling and looking more than a little aggrieved. Superintendent Wilson, in his rare personal appearances in the work of detection, had one great advantage: he was not known by sight even to most of the habitual criminal class. He had, therefore, on this occasion at least, no need to disguise himself. He merely went to Carter Woodman's office as a prospective client who had been strongly recommended to him. He wanted both to have a look at Woodman himself and to see whether anything more could be got out of Moorman on the question of the stick. Woodman was engaged with a client when he arrived, and he had a favourable chance of making friends with the old clerk before he was shown into the inner office. He used his opportunity for that alone, making no attempt to lead the conversation towards the business on which he had come. In a very few minutes he was shown into Woodman's private office. Looking his man up and down, he noted, as the inspector had noted before him, the powerful physique, the straining vitality, and the false geniality of Woodman's manner. But he could also see that the man was seriously worried. There was, for all his appearance of heartiness, a harried look about him, and he seemed preoccupied as, with an excellent assumption of business incapacity, his visitor began to unfold a long story about a lease and a mortgage which he wished to negotiate. Woodman listened with growing impatience, as his superintendent meant that he should. At length he interrupted, saying that the details could be dealt with later. His visitor was most apologetic, never had a head for business, but positively must get the matter dealt with that day. He lived away in the country. Mr. Amos Porter of Sunderland in Sussex was his description for the nonce, and he could not be in town again for weeks. Woodman finally suggested that, as there was other work he must do, Mr. Porter should settle the details with his clerk, an excellent man of business, who would be able to tell him all he wanted. Mr. Porter, after a perfunctory attempt to go on with his explanation to the principal, agreed, and he was soon back in the other office with Moorman. Mr. Porter had left his hat, coat and stick in the outer office when he went in to see Woodman, laying the stick on a chair and covering it with his coat. His business with Moorman was soon done, and he crossed the room to get his things. By a curious accident, while he was struggling into his coat, he dropped a stick at Moorman's feet. Moorman picked it up, but as he was passing it back to his owner, he started violently and almost dropped it. "A queer old stick, is it not?" said Mr. Porter. "I value it highly for its associations." Moorman peered at him oddly. "I beg pardon, sir, but isn't that the stick a gentleman I know used to carry?" No, I have had the stick for years. I bought it let me see. Where did I buy it? Never mind. I had no idea there was another like it. That is most interesting. May I ask who uses such a stick?" "The gentleman's name is Brooklyn, Mr. Walter Brooklyn. He had one very like yours." "God bless my soul. Not the fellow whose name has been in all the papers?" "Dear me, what was it about?" "I know it was in the papers. Mr. Brooklyn was suspected wrongly of murder." "Oh, yes, I remember now. And you know, Mr. Brooklyn? How interesting. Moomin lowered his voice. He was in the office with that stick on the very day on which the murders were committed. Dear, dear. It is coming back to me. There was something about the stick in the papers. How odd it should be like mine. It was found in the room where one of the murders took place. And you saw Mr. Brooklyn with the stick when he left this office the same day. Dear me, that must have looked very bad for him. But he was released, wasn't he? Yes, the police let him go. And did you give evidence, Mr. Moomin? Did you have to say you had seen him leave this office with that stick in his hands? It must be a terrible ordeal to be a witness. Terrible. I didn't have to give evidence. And in any case, I didn't see the stick when Mr. Brooklyn left the office. Oh, I see. He hadn't the stick with him when he left? Then, of course, it wouldn't go so much against him, it being found. Why, it might have been my stick. And Mr. Porter gave a curious high laugh. Well, Is it Moomin? Thank you. You have told me just what I wanted to know about my mortgage. I will write him, sending all the documents. Good morning. Safely out of earshot and eyeshot of Woodman's office, Superintendent Wilson had a quiet laugh. A little diplomacy does it, he said to himself. Now I know all about the stick. And next for another little exploration. The superintendent's next visit was paid in his proper person. Driving to Liskeed House, he asked to be shown up to Princep's room, where everything was still just as it had been when the murder was discovered. There he made a careful examination of the room and all its contents, seeking for any weapon with which the murder could possibly have been done. His search was fruitless, and after a while he passed to the window and gazed out thoughtfully into the garden below. The roof of the antique temple showed over the intervening trees, but the place where the murder of George Brooklyn had taken place was completely hidden by the trees and the bushes growing around them. The superintendent cast back in his mind to discover whether the bushes had been searched for possible clues. He assumed that they had. It was an elementary precaution, but he had best have a hunt round himself. Something might have been overlooked. He went down the private staircase into the garden and began his search. Nothing rewarded his efforts, though he spent a good hour searching, and it was with a puzzled expression that he went upstairs again to Princep's room, resuming his stand at the window and gazing out. Suddenly something seemed to catch his attention. Leaning as far out of the window as he could, he studied intently what he could see of the roof. It's just a possibility, he muttered as he closed the window and crossed the room. What Superintendent Wilson had remarked was that almost on the level of Princep's window was a roof of that part of the house which projected over the stable yard. It was not near enough for any entry to the room to be effected by its means, but it was easily within reach of a throw, and an object cast away upon it would be completely invisible and safely disposed of until some day, probably distant, when the roof might need repair. It was an admirable place for the bestowal of any inconvenient piece of property. By means of the landing window, the superintendent found his way without much difficulty out onto the roof and was easily able to climb over its gable side to the flat space in the center. And there at last his efforts were rewarded, for on the roof lay, clearly just where it had been thrown, a small bag heavily loaded, not with sand, but with small shot, a deadly weapon. Stuffing the thing into his pocket, the superintendent climbed back with more difficulty and shut the window behind him. He chuckled softly to himself. He had reasoned aright, and here at last was a clue that had not been laid to mislead, a real clue that he must make to point straight at the murderer. He went back to his office to examine his find at leisure. The end of chapter 33. Chapter 34 of the Brooklyn Murders. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganandh. The Brooklyn Murders by G.D.H. Cole. Chapter 34. The Stable Yard. While Superintendent Wilson, by his own methods, was thus working towards a solution of the mystery, John and Ellery were also pursuing their investigations along their separate line. There was but one thing needed, they felt, to complete their case and turn their conviction from moral to legal certainty. How had Woodman got into Liskeed House? That was a question which Joan had set herself to answer. The courtyard seemed to be the only possible means of access. It was a large square yard opening into Liskeed Street by a pair of massive wooden doors 10 feet high and a small gate let into the wall at the side. Neither the wall nor the doors could be climbed without the aid of a long ladder. One entering by these doors would find himself in the yard. On his left, he would have the side wall of Liskeard House, which had no window looking out onto the yard. On his right would be the large coach house, now used as a garage, above which lived the chauffeur and his wife, formerly a domestic of Sir Vernon's, both servants of long standing. The apartment had also a door opening into Liskeard Street and a way down into the garage. Immediately opposite, anyone entering the yard from the street was an extension built out from the side of Liskeard House towards the back. The ground floor of this was occupied by storerooms, accessible only from the yard, but between these a passage led through directly into the garden. Above were rooms belonging to Liskeard House, whose windows looked out only upon the garden. Joan, as she stood in the yard, noticed first that if the outer door were open and the yard itself empty, as at this moment, there was nothing to prevent anyone from walking straight through into the garden. For, as she knew, the gate leading to the garden, though it was shut, was never locked save at night. The big front gates of the yard stood open most of the day, and in any case, the small gate beside them was not locked until the whole place was shut up for the night. A man wishing to get into the garden would only have to watch until the yard itself was empty, and he would then have every chance of getting through without being observed. In the chauffeur's apartments, above the garage, only one window looked down on the yard, and this, as Joan knew, was a tiny spare room seldom occupied. Even if Woodman had come in by this way, there was only a very slender chance that he had been noticed. The chauffeur came into the yard from the garage, and Joan entered in to talk with him. Usually locked up when no one had the car out in the evening at 9:30 or 10. On this occasion, Lucas's car had been in the garage during dinner, and he had kept the place open after Lucas went in case anyone might want a car out. He had locked the whole place up at 11 o'clock and had then gone straight to bed. Had anyone, Joan asked, entered by the yard entrance before he locked up? He had seen no one, but he had not been in the yard all the time. He went away to ask his wife, and came back to assure Joan that although she had been in the yard part of the time, she too had seen no one pass that way. There was no one else, was there? Joan asked, about that night. No one. But then the chauffeur seemed to be plunged into thought. Yes, miss, there was someone else. Miss Parker, Nora, what used to be the cook, miss. She came in to help with the dinner, and she stayed the night with us. She went to bed early, she did, about 10:30. She had to leave early next morning. She went away before they found out what had happened in the night. Was she sleeping in the little room up there? Yes, miss, and when I looked up at 11 o'clock, she was sitting at the window there. She said she couldn't sleep and was trying to read herself off. Then she might have seen anyone come in? Yes, miss, she might. Do you know where she is now? She is with my wife this very moment, miss. She is in a job now, away in Essex. That's where she went when she left that morning. But it's her day off, miss, and she has come up to see us. Joan asked to speak to the woman, and was soon in the parlour with her and the chauffeur's wife. Did I see anyone come through the courtyard that night? Yes, I did, miss, but I didn't think nothing of it. It was about 11:15, and I was looking out of the spare room window when a gentleman came into the yard. It was too dark down in the yard at first to see who it was, but as he passed under the lamp by the gate leading into the garden, I saw his face. Who was it? Did you know him? Mr. Woodman, miss. Of course, I thought it was all right, seeing as it was him. And he went through into the garden? Yes, miss. You didn't see him come out again? No, miss. No one else passed through the yard before Mr. Purvis here came and locked up. Now, Nora, I don't want you to tell anyone, or you, Purvis, or your wife, that Nora saw Mr. Woodman come in. It's very important. You shouldn't mention it just yet. Mrs. Purvis curtsied, and Nora also agreed to say nothing. Purvis himself began by saying, Certainly, miss, if you wish it. And then he seemed to realize the implications contained in Joan's request. His jaw dropped, and his mouth hung open. Then he said, Beg pardon, miss, but surely you don't mean as Mr. Woodman had aught to do with this terrible affair? Never mind, Purvis, just now what I mean. I'm not accusing anybody, but I knew someone came in by the yard, and I wanted to make sure who it was. Well, miss, you can make sure we won't say nothing about it. They kept their word, no doubt. and said nothing to anyone else. But when John had gone, they said a great deal among themselves. John's questions had been enough to make them suspect that Woodman might be concerned in the murders. And though nothing was said of John's discovery, Purvis's dark and unsupported suspicions of Woodman, and Mrs. Purvis's hints of what she could say if she had a mind, were soon all round the servants' hall. It was not surprising that these rumours soon came to Inspector Blaikie's ears. He was not at first inclined to attach much importance to them, for they appeared to be no more than below-stairs gossip, and the fact of Woodman's unpopularity with the servants, which had not escaped his observation, seemed sufficiently to account for the vague suspicions. Servants, he said to himself, were always ready to suspect anyone they disliked, and in this case they were all strong partisans of Winter, and highly indignant at the share of the attentions which the police had bestowed on the men servants at Liskeard House. All the same, the inspector traced the rumours to the chauffeur's wife and made up his mind to have a little talk with her. He began brusquely. It was his way of dealing with women whom he thought he could frighten, by asking her what she meant by concealing information from the police. The woman was plainly embarrassed, but she only said that she did not know what he meant. He accused her of saying in the servants' hall that she knew who had committed the murders in Liskeard House, but that she wasn't going to say anything. Her reply was to deny all knowledge and to inform the inspector that those that said she said such things wasn't fit not to associate with the decent folks. The more the inspector tried to browbeat her, the less would she say. She grew sulky and told him to let a poor woman alone and not go putting into her mouth things she never said. She didn't know anything, and if she did, she wouldn't tell him. Inspector Blaikie retired from the contest beaten, but warning her that he would call again. He did not, however, retire so far as to prevent him from seeing that, as soon as she believed herself to be alone, the chauffeur's wife hurried into Liskeard House by the back way and went straight up by the back stairs. Putting two and two together, he speedily concluded that she had gone to see John Cooper, and that John probably knew all that she knew and had told her to keep quiet about it. The inspector made up his mind to see John as soon as the woman had gone. Meanwhile, Mrs. Purvis was telling John about the inspector's visit and begging pardon for having let her tongue wag in the servants' hall. "But I didn't tell him nothing, miss. You can rest assured of that. I sent him away with a flea in his ear, miss." At this moment, Ellery was announced. John dismissed Mrs. Purvis with a further caution to say nothing for the present. As soon as she had gone, Ellery told John of his visit to Sir John Bunnery and of the fact that Woodman had been in serious financial straits before the murder took place. "It seems to be true enough about your stepfather making a will in his favour. It's all very odd. I don't understand it a bit. I'm afraid there's almost nothing he wouldn't do for money, except murder," said John. Old Sir John seemed to think that murder was quite a venial offence in comparison with getting money by false pretences, Ellery answered, laughing. "Don't be silly, Bob. I've found out how Carter got into the house, and I've got the proof." And then John told the story of the coach-house yard, a story which proved beyond doubt that Woodman had been on the scene of the crime. "Well done, John. So that makes it certain he was here. I'm really beginning to think, Bob, we are rather clever people. My dear, we have done the trick. Do you realize that it practically finishes our case? We have got enough now to be quite sure of a conviction." "Oh, Bob, how horrible it is when you put it that way. It has really been rather fun finding it all out. But now we have found out, what are we to do about it?" "The obvious thing would be to tell the police." "I suppose it would. But think of the trial, the horrible publicity of it. And I don't a bit want to see Carter hanged, though he may deserve it. Think of poor Helen." "My dear John, of course you don't, but it is not easy to hush up a thing like this." "Bob, need we tell the police? They don't know what we have been doing. Must we tell them now?" "Blessed if I know, darling. But I forgot to tell you about what the old lawyer chap Bunnery said. He wants it hushed up all right." "Then that means we can hush it up." "I don't know whether we can or not. But I tell you what I suggest we do. You come down with me and see Carter Woodman. We shall have to tell him what we know and force him to admit the whole thing. Then we'll see what he means to do. Perhaps he might agree to run away to Australia or something before the police find out. And then we can see old Bunnery and get his advice and decide what to do about telling them." Before John could answer the string of proposals, there came a knock at the door,
and Inspector Blaikie walked into the room. John and Ellery evidently showed their embarrassment, for he stood looking curiously at them for a moment and then said reassuringly that he had only come in to have a word or two, if he might. John asked him to sit down and offered him a cigarette. The inspector lighted it deliberately, and then he suddenly shot a question at them. "What is it that you have told the chauffeur's wife not to tell me?" John looked quickly at Ellery, and Ellery looked at John, but neither of them answered. Come, Miss Cooper. You really must not try to prevent the police from getting information, or you will force us to conclude that you wish to shield the murderer." Still John made no answer. "I hope, Miss Cooper, that it is only that you and your friend have been doing a little detective work on your own and wanted to have all the credit for yourselves. But don't you think the time has come for telling me what you know?" Ellery did not answer the question directly. "Look here, Inspector," he said. "You think we know all about these murders and are trying to keep the truth from you. It looks mighty like it. Well, in a sense, I don't say we haven't been keeping something back, but I give you my word that we are not in collusion with the murderer or anything of that sort. There's a very special reason why we can't tell you quite everything just now, for what it is worth." "Does the very special reason apply to Miss Cooper as well?" "Yes," said John. "For the moment it does." Ellery went on. "Of course, I know you have a grievance. You're going to tell us we are abetting the criminal, whoever he is, and that we shall be getting into trouble if we are not careful." "So you will," said the inspector. "Very serious trouble. All the same, Inspector, I'm afraid we must risk it. Very likely we shall be free to tell you the whole story, or what we know of it, in a day or two. But we won't tell you now. That's flat." "A day or two is ample time for a criminal to get away." "Maybe, but I don't think you need worry about that. You have given him enough time to get away if he wants to. In any case, we are not going to tell you. I'm sorry, but I warn you that you are conspiring to defeat the ends of justice. Sorry and all that. Another time, Inspector, we shall look forward to an interesting talk. But for the present, good morning." The inspector took the hint and left the room in a very bad temper. His parting shot was that he must report their conduct to his official superior. "What on earth are we to do now?" said John. "Go and see Carter Woodman at once, I think. When we have done that, we shall know better how to act. But suppose he runs away when he hears our story, flies the country, I mean. Wouldn't that be the best way out? I don't want to see him hanged any more than you do. As the inspector said, we run some risk ourselves that way. But the worst of it is that the whole story is bound to come out. I don't see how it can be kept secret in any case, or rather, I only see one possible way. What's that? Wait till we have been to Woodman. I want to see if he will be man enough to take it." "I don't know what you mean, but I suppose we had better see Woodman." "Yes, and there's no time to lose if the inspector is on the trail." John and Ellery took a taxi and ordered the driver to drive to Woodman's office. But they underestimated the inspector's promptness in action. They did not know that behind them followed another taxi containing Inspector Blaikie and 2 plainclothes detectives. The end of chapter 34.
Chapter 35 of the Brooklyn Murders. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganandh. The Brooklyn Murders. G.D.H. Cole. Chapter 35. An order for bulbs. Superintendent Wilson's examination of his find took him some little time. The bag was of ordinary stout canvas, most unlikely to be capable of identification. The small shot also was of a kind which can be purchased at any gunsmith's and at most ironmongers. To trace the criminal by means of either of these clues seemed virtually impossible. But this was not the end of the matter. Taking the shot, the superintendent carefully sifted it, and by he had separated from the pile of shot quite a number of other minute objects which had lain among it. There were several small pieces of cardboard, a few fragments of matches, some wisps of tobacco, a few balls of fluff, 2 pins, 3 small nails, and several tiny scraps of paper. Some or all of these might, of course, have got mixed up with the shot before ever it came into the murderer's possession, and most of them were not at all likely in any case to afford a clue. But the chance was worth trying, and the inspector made a minute examination of them all. The scraps of paper alone seemed to hold out any hope of a clue. 2 of them were blank. One was an indistinguishable fragment of a newspaper, apparently from the typography, the Times. The other 2, which fitted together, contained a few words written by hand. The words were unimportant, merely 12 dozen hyacinths, 15 dozen tulips, 10 dozen SQ, the last word being cut short by a tear. The paper was evidently part of an order, or of a memorandum for an order for garden bulbs. But the writing, the superintendent compared it with a note which he had received from Woodman, the writing was very like. He could not say positively that they were the same. He must compare the scrap of paper with other specimens of Woodman's hand. A second visit to Woodman's office in the guise of Mr. Porter, the unbusinesslike mortgage maker, would probably afford the opportunity. Superintendent Wilson called a taxi and drove away in the direction of Lincoln's Inn. The Fates, watching outside that very ordinary-looking office, had a more than usually amusing time that afternoon. As Joan and Ellery, after dismissing their taxi, entered the outer office, a second taxi drew up a few doors off, just out of view. Inspector Blaikie leapt out, and after him 2 plainclothes officers. The inspector rapidly posted his men. "There's no back way out of these premises," he said, "so we have an easy job. I'm going right in now, and I want you to wait outside and follow any of our people who come out. You know them all by sight. If Carter Woodman comes out, don't lose sight of him on any account. But don't detain him unless it's quite impossible to keep an eye on him. I shall probably keep my eye on the other 2 myself." So saying, the inspector disappeared into the building. He had no clearly formed plan in his mind, but his suspicions had been thoroughly aroused, and he feared that John and Ellery had gone to warn Woodman to fly from the country. A few minutes after the inspector had entered the office, his 2 subordinates had the surprise of their lives. A third taxi drew up at the door, and out of it stepped no less a person than Superintendent Wilson. While they were debating whether to speak to him, his quick eye caught sight of them, and rapidly walking a little away along the street in order to be out of view, he beckoned them to come. "What are you doing here?" he asked. In a few words, the men told him that Inspector Blaikie and John and Ellery as well were inside, and that they had received instructions to remain on the watch and to follow Woodman if he came out. The superintendent thought rapidly. If he went in, it would be obviously impossible to maintain his alias of Mr. Porter, and he ran the risk of interrupting a most important conversation. If, on the other hand, he stayed outside, what blunder might not be committed in his absence? Telling the men to remain on guard and follow the inspector's instruction, he entered the building. He did not, however, go to the door of Woodman's outer office. Instead, he went along the corridor to where, as he remembered, the private door from Woodman's inner sanctum gave on the passage. There he paused and listened. Someone was speaking within, but not a word was audible through the stout door. There was no keyhole, and nothing was to be seen either. The superintendent must fare further to the back of the building if he sought to find out what was in progress in Woodman's room. There might be a window looking on the room, through which he could watch unobserved. He soon found a back door leading into a small flagged yard at the rear of the building. It was locked, but the key was in place. Unlocking it, he slipped out into the yard and easily located the window of Woodman's room. By standing on a water butt, he could see the 3 people, Joan, Ellery, and Carter Woodman, within, but the window was closed and he could hear nothing. He remained at his post of vantage, watching. The end of chapter 35. Chapter 36 of the Brooklyn Murders. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganandh. The Brooklyn Murders by G.D.H. Cole. Chapter 36. An Afternoon Call. Hardly had Joan and Ellery passed from the outer office into Woodman's private room when the inspector entered the room they had left and asked if Mr. Woodman was in. Moorman, who had met the inspector several times lately, saw nothing strange in the visit and merely replied that his employer was in, but he was at the moment engaged. "If you care to wait, sir, I dare say he won't be long." Blaikie said that he would wait, and Moorman thereupon suggested that he should go in and tell his principal that the inspector was there. But the inspector told him not to bother. He would take his chance when Woodman was free. He sat down, therefore, to wait in the outer office, improving the minutes by conversing with the loquacious old clerk about his employer's affairs. Meanwhile, Joan and Ellery were seated with Carter Woodman. He had greeted them rather effusively on their entrance.
and in no one's presence they had thought it best to shake hands and behave as if nothing were the matter. Woodman had placed chairs for them and had again sat down at his desk. While they spoke, he continued for a while mechanically opening and glancing at the pile of letters before him. It was Joan who spoke first. "We have come here," she said, "because it seemed the only thing to do. When we have heard what you have to say, we shall know better what our next step must be." Something in her voice caused Woodman to look up sharply. The tone was hard, and a glance at his two visitors showed him that their errand was not a pleasant one. But he looked down again and went on opening his letters without making any sign. "We have to tell you," Joan went on, "that we know now who killed John Prinsep and poor George." Woodman gave a start as she spoke, but all he said was, "Then, my dear Joan, you know a great deal more than I do." "I'll put it another way," said Joan. "We know that you killed them." She got the words out with an effort, breathing hard and clutching the arm of the chair as she spoke. Woodman dropped the letter he was holding and looked straight at her. "My dear Joan," he said, "are you quite mad? And you too, Mr. Ellery?" "No, we are not mad. We know," said Ellery with a short, uneasy laugh, a laugh that grated. Woodman looked from the one to the other. "I fear you are both mad," he said very quietly. "And now, will one of you please tell me what you mean by this extraordinary accusation?" "You had better hear what we have to say before you start protesting," said Ellery. "Let me tell you exactly what happened at Liskeard House last Tuesday. Then you will see that we know. You are supposed to have been at your hotel in the small writing room on the first floor between 10:45 and 11:30 or after. So I was, of course. But we can produce a gentleman who was in the writing room between those hours and can swear that you were not. Oh, I may have slipped out of the room for a while, but it is preposterous. You had better hear me out. This gentleman saw you leave the writing room and go downstairs at a few minutes to 11. Shortly after, he went to the room himself and remained there 3/4 of an hour. He saw you return to the writing room rather before 11:15. This is pure nonsense. But what of it, even if it were true? This. When you left the room, you went down to the basement of the hotel, which was deserted, and let yourself out by unbarring the side door leading from the grill room into St. John Street. You also returned that way shortly after 11:30. Again, I say that you are talking absolute nonsense. But if it pleases you, pray continue this fairy tale." John took up the story. "You walked across to Liskeard House and entered the garden through the courtyard shortly before it was locked for the night. I will pass over what you did next, but at a time shortly before 11:30, probably about 1/4 you put on John Prinsep's hat and coat and walked up and down the garden, imitating his lameness in a spot where you could be seen from the back of the theatre. You then went upstairs to John's room and delivered, imitating my stepfather's voice, a false telephone message purporting to come from him to his club in Pall Mall. Next, you put on George's hat and coat and, dressed in them, walked out of the front door in such a way that the servants, seeing you at a distance, readily mistook you for George. Am I right so far?" "I am listening, my dear John, because I had better hear the whole of this wild story that something or someone," here he turned and glared at Ellery, "has put into your head. But of course the whole thing is monstrous. You need not blame Mr. Ellery. He and I have worked it all out together, and we can prove all we say. We should have mentioned that before leaving Liskeard House, you arranged the scene of the murders so as to make it seem, first of all, that John and George had killed each other. Under John's body you placed a blood-stained handkerchief belonging to George, and you also left one of George's knives sticking in the body. You killed George with a weapon which, as you well know, had on it John's finger marks. Of course, you wore gloves, and therefore left no marks which could be identified as your own. The finger marks on the club with which George was killed were made by John earlier in the day when he showed you the club before dinner. They were defaced, but not obliterated by the marks made later by your gloved hands. Is that correct?" "Of course it is not correct. It's a parcel of lies, the whole lot of it." "Really, Mr. Woodman," said Ellery, "you will find that the whole story is remarkably convincing to others, if not to you. Let me give you an account of the objects you had in view. You knew that it was physically impossible for John and George to have killed each other, but by leaving the signs as you did,
You hoped to create the impression that either might have killed the other. Your main object, however, was not to create suspicion against each of these two, but to incriminate another person, whom you decide to remove for reasons of your own. You therefore faked the telephone message I have mentioned, and you also left Walter Brooklyn's stick in John Princip's room. You also detached the ferrule from the stick with your penknife and left the ferrule in the garden on the spot where George was murdered. By actual murder, you had already on Tuesday night removed 2 of the 3 persons who would stand between you and Sir Vernon's fortune. You hoped that, by means of the clues which you provided, the law would do your work in removing the 3rd. I will not ask you whether this is true. We know it. Woodman shrugged his shoulders. Oh, if you know it, he said, of course there is nothing for me to say. You left Liskeed House wearing George's hat and overcoat. These you took back to the hotel and stowed away in a handbag for the night. You went out the next morning carrying the handbag, which you brought to this office. At lunchtime, you took it with you. I do not know where you lunched, but you went into the cloakroom of the Avenue restaurant as if you were going to lunch there and left the hat and coat hanging on a peg. You hoped that it would be impossible to trace them to you. They have been traced. During Ellery's last speech, Woodman's forced calm at first showed some sign of breaking, but he pulled himself together with an effort. I must say you have laid this plot very carefully, he said. Unfortunately, not only have you been traced, John went on, but you were unwise enough not to notice, when you left the coat, that it lacked a button. You left that button deep down in the corner of the bag which is now in that cupboard over there. With a sudden cry, Woodman rose from his chair and sprang towards the cupboard. He tore the bag open and felt wildly in it. Then he flung the bag away. No, said John. The button is not there, Mr. Woodman. No. It is safe somewhere else. And I think, Mr. Woodman, what you have just done rather disposes of the cause of injured innocence, don't you? Asked Ellery. Woodman kicked the bag savagely into a corner and sank into his chair. His face had gone dead white. Shakily he poured out and drank a glass of water. Your hopes of removing my stepfather by due process of law, John continued, were unfortunately frustrated. You were therefore in the position of having committed 2 murders for nothing, unless you could find some fresh means of profiting by them. You found such means. As soon as you heard of my stepfather's release, you made your plans. Soon after his release, you met him, and somehow or other persuaded him to make a will in your favor. I do not know how you did it, but I presume there was some agreement between you to share the proceeds of your deal. You then attempted, on the strength of your joint expectations under Sir Vernon's will, to raise a large loan from one who was a friend of yours, Sir John Bunnery. You were in serious financial trouble, and only a considerable immediate supply of money could save you from bankruptcy and disgrace. That, I think, is correct. John paused, but this time Woodman had nothing to say. His face had gone greyer still. He stared at John and his hand straight towards one of the drawers of the table before him, but he remained silent. This time, however, John pressed him for an answer. Do you admit now that what I have said is true? She asked. And as he still said nothing, we can prove it all, you know, Ellery added. Woodman pulled himself together with an effort. You have told the police all this? He asked. Not a word as yet, said John. We decided to see you first. May I ask why? If it can be helped, we do not want your wife to suffer more than she must for what you have done. Nor do we want a scandal. If you will leave the country and never come back, we will do what we can to hush the whole thing up. A light came into Woodman's ashen face. I see, he said. Do you admit that all we have told you is true? It doesn't seem to be much good denying it now. You will sign in our presence a confession that you committed these murders? I don't know what for. No, I won't sign anything. But you admit it. Between ourselves, yes. In public, 1,000 times no. Woodman even smiled as he said this. You admit it to us. Yes, yes. Haven't I said so? But there are some things not even you seem to know. Won't you tell us them, Mr. Woodman, just to make our story complete? Said Ellery. Remember that we are proposing to let you go. We are taking some risks in doing that. Not for my sake, I'll be bound, but I don't mind telling you. What do you want to know? How the murders were actually done. Oh, I have no objection to telling you. Indeed, I flatter myself the thing was rather prettily arranged. Woodman had almost regained his outward composure and spoke with some of his accustomed assurance. I went into the garden of Liskeet House just as you said, by the courtyard. I have no idea how you discovered that. Then I went straight up the back stairs to Princep's room. No one saw me go upstairs, I take it, or you would have mentioned the fact. I found Princep at his table writing. I laid him out with a big blow on the back of the head. With what weapon? With a sandbag. Then it has not been found? I threw it out afterwards onto the roof of the stables out of sight. Then, as I wasn't sure if he was dead, I made sure with a knife I found lying on the table. It belonged, I knew, to George Brooklyn. I don't know how it got there. It wasn't part of my plan. I finished him off with that and went out onto the landing. Just then I heard someone coming upstairs. It was George Brooklyn. Until that moment I had no definite intention of killing George that night. I meant to leave signs which would show that George and Walter had conspired to kill Princep. I had put a handkerchief of George's under the body. George's coming just then was deuced awkward. I had no time to clear away the traces, and I had somehow to prevent him from entering the room. So I met him on the landing and told him that Princep was in the garden and wanted him to go down. He went down the back stairs with me like a lamb. It was then it occurred to me that, as he had seen me up in Princep's room, I should have to kill him too. I led him over towards the temple and let him get a few paces in front. Then I seized a club from the Hercules statue and smashed his head in from behind. After that, I had to consider how to cover my tracks. I dragged the body into the temple entrance, fetched Princep's coat and hat, and walked up and down the garden as you know. Then I went up again to Princep's room and sent off the telephone message and arranged things there, leaving George's handkerchief under the body and Walter's stick in the room. I had already dropped the ferule in the garden and a note in Princep's writing making an appointment for the garden. He had sent it to me the previous day. George had left his hat and overcoat on the landing. I had intended to slip out unobserved somehow, but seeing the coat and hat gave me an idea. I put them on and walked out as George Brooklyn, thus throwing everyone wrong, as I thought, about the time of the murders. All the rest you seem to know. Said Ellery. You are a remarkably cold-blooded scoundrel. Perhaps, but we can keep our opinions of each other to ourselves. You would prefer me to go away rather than stay and face your accusation. Isn't that so? I suppose you can put it that way, said Ellery. Well, I can't go without money. That's the position. And I want a good lot. I can't lay hands on money at short notice, and you will have to find it. Besides, remember that if you don't accuse me, I am still Walter Brooklyn's heir, and he is Sir Vernon's. I understand it is most unlikely Sir Vernon will live to make another will. Now, how much can you provide, and how soon? That is a business proposition we have to settle between us. I am prepared to disappear for the present, and I'll go further for a suitable consideration, and promise never to come back to this country. But my condition is that I get half of whatever comes to Joan when Sir Vernon dies. How does that strike you? Joan had listened with feeling of nausea to Woodman's confession, but now she broke in indignantly. I'm afraid, she said, that you are a little after the fair. It's quite true that, under my stepfather's new will, you appear to be the principal heir. It is also true that my stepfather stood to inherit a large sum of money, until Sir Vernon made a new will. Joan said these words very slowly and distinctly. As Woodman heard them, the colour, which had quite come back, faded again from his face, and he stared at her with a consternation that deepened as she went on. We had not quite finished our story. After your wicked bargain with my stepfather, you attempted to raise money on the strength of being his, and therefore indirectly Sir Vernon's heir. I know how hard up you were. Indeed, pressure from creditors will, I hope, provide a good enough reason for your absconding now. If you choose to spread the report that you have died abroad, we shall certainly not object. But you will get no money from us. As I was saying, you went to Sir John Bunnery and tried to raise a large sum from him on the ground of your expectations. But you may not know that Sir John at once wrote privately to Sir Vernon to ask whether you were really the heir, or that yesterday Sir Vernon rallied enough to make a new will.
That will, of course, excludes both you and my stepfather altogether." At these words, the color came suddenly back into Woodman's cheeks. In a second, he pulled open a drawer in the desk before him, seized from it a revolver, and took aim at John. But Ellery was just too quick for him, knocking up his arm so that the bullet embedded itself in the ceiling. Woodman at once turned on Ellery, closing with him, and a fierce struggle began. At this moment there was a sound of breaking glass, and rapidly opening the window through the hole which he had made, Superintendent Wilson leapt into the room. At the same time, the door leading to the outer office began to rattle, as if someone were attempting to open it from without, but it was locked and resisted all efforts to break it open. Then someone smashed the glass panel above, and the head of Inspector Blaikie, with Moorman's terrified face behind, appeared in the gap. At sight of the superintendent, Ellery relaxed his hold for a moment, and Woodman broke loose. But this time, instead of aiming at John, he turned the weapon upon himself. Putting the barrel of the revolver to his temple, he fired. When a moment later the inspector forced an entrance, he found John, Ellery, and Superintendent Wilson bending over Carter Woodman's body. The end of chapter 36. Chapter 37 of the Brooklyn Murders. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Read by Yoganandh. The Brooklyn Murders by G.D.H. Cole. Chapter 37. A Happy Ending. John, Ellery, and the superintendent faced one another across Woodman's body. Moorman, his nerves gone, crouched in a corner, muttering. The inspector bent down and made a quick inspection of the body. He said, "He's quite dead." The superintendent turned to Ellery. "And now perhaps it is time for you to give me a little explanation." "Of this?" asked Ellery, pointing to the body. "Of everything," was the answer. "It is straightforward enough," said Ellery. "Mr. Woodman, as you will easily discover if you ask that whimpering object over there, has been for some time in grave financial difficulties. This morning he was disappointed of raising a large amount for which he had hoped, and I am afraid this is the result." "Is that all you have to tell me?" "What more should I have?" "May I ask whether you have any theory as to the murderer of George Brooklyn or of John Princip?" "I have no theory, and I cannot see what that has to do with this suicide." Ellery emphasized the last word. "Oh, that's your line, is it? And supposing I suggested that this gentleman here," he pointed to Woodman's body, "was the murderer? I should ask you what evidence you have to support such an extraordinary suggestion." "Very well, Mr. Ellery, but I had better tell you that I already have full knowledge of the truth. That is why I am here. You and the young lady here had much better make a clean breast of it. Don't you think, Superintendent, that you had better deal with one thing at a time? Surely for the moment this dead man claims your attention. You know where to find us if you want us. I shall take Miss Cooper home." "By all means, Mr. Ellery. There is work for me here, but I shall have to call on you both later in the day. Could I meet you, say, at Liskeet House about 6 o'clock? "Oh, if that's the attitude you take, I suppose we had better have it out now." "That'll be best, I think." Then Superintendent Wilson turned to the inspector, who had not recovered from his amazement at the miraculous appearance of his superior. The superintendent pointed to Woodman's body. "Call in your men and have the thing removed. Then we can say what we have to say." So when the body had been taken away, John and Ellery found themselves face to face with Superintendent Wilson. "I'll tell you what I know," he said, "and then I think you will see the wisdom of letting me hear your story. But first there is one thing I must do." Going to Woodman's desk, he took from his pocketbook the scraps of paper which he had found and rapidly compared them with other specimens of Woodman's handwriting. "Just as I thought," he said. "And now I'm ready." "Fire away then," said Ellery. "Well, it was clear enough to me from an early stage in the case, even before you confirmed my view with your very convincing alibi, that Mr. Walter Brooklyn was not the murderer. That was the assumption on which I set to work." "May I ask why?" said John. "Of course, I knew he hadn't done it. But what made you—" "A quite proper question, Miss Cooper. What made me take that view was a very strong conviction that the clues, the second set of clues, pointed far too directly to Mr. Brooklyn. They looked as if they had been deliberately laid. I ought to have seen that at once. but I was put off by the other set of clues, the obviously false ones, that the police were meant to see through from the first. It took me a little time to realize that the murderer had been clever enough to lay two separate sets of false clues, one meant to be seen through and one meant to mislead. Yes, we got to that too, though we didn't put it quite as you do. Quite so. Well, as soon as I reached that conclusion, it became clear that the murderer had strong reasons for removing not only your two cousins but also your stepfather. My next step, therefore, was to discover who would be most likely to inherit Sir Vernon Brooklyn's money if Mr. Walter Brooklyn was safely out of the way. So that brought you to Carter Woodman at once? In a sense, yes. But of course, at that stage I had no sort of proof. I set out to prove what was only a theory. Yes, that was what we did. Tell us what you found out, said Ellery, half rising from his chair in his excitement. You remember that Mr. Walter Brooklyn's stick was found in Mr. Prinsep's room? Well, I succeeded in proving that Mr. Brooklyn had left that stick in Carter Woodman's office on the day of the murders. Lord, we never thought of that, said Ellery. Moorman, whom you know, admitted that to me, not knowing who I was. I got it out of him when he thought I was merely a client taking an outside interest in the case. He didn't realize that it was of importance. And that was your proof? Asked John with an air of disappointment. Dear me, Miss Cooper, I should be very sorry to try to hang a man on such evidence. That was only a beginning. What puzzled me was that, whereas the weapon with which Mr. George Brooklyn was killed was found on the scene of the murder, there was no sign of any weapon which could have killed Mr. Prinsep. So I made a thorough, fresh search, and at last, on the roof of the building which projects over towards the courtyard, I found the weapon, where the murderer had thrown it out of sight. It was a bag filled with small shot. But I don't see how you could prove whose it was. One moment, Mr. Ellery. I took that bag away and went carefully through its contents. Among them I found two tiny scraps of paper, obviously part of an order, or a memorandum of an order for garden bulbs. When I went to the desk there just now, it was to confirm my view that the writing was Carter Woodman's. I was right. So that proved it, said John. I would not go so far as to say that, said Superintendent Wilson, but it made a case with certain other points which you probably know as well as I, Woodman's financial difficulties and so on. I had not, however, finished my case. In fact, when I came here, I was pursuing my investigations. Your presence and that of the inspector were quite unexpected. Indeed, I may say that you interrupted me. Sorry and all that, said Ellery. But you see, we had finished a case and proved Carter Woodman's guilt so that he knew the game was up. Hence the end of the story as you saw it just now. I suggest, Mr. Ellery and Miss Cooper, that in view of what we both know, the only possible course is to pool our information. I have told you my evidence. Will you be good enough now to tell me yours? John and Ellery looked at each other, and John nodded. They both realized that it was inevitable that they should tell Superintendent Wilson all they knew. You tell him, Bob, I'm not up to it, said John, smiling faintly. But Superintendent, you realize, don't you, how anxious we have been that this horrible story should not come to light? It has caused misery enough already. The telling of it will only cause more. I understand, said the Superintendent. Then can't we still keep it to ourselves? Said John with a note of hope in her voice. The Superintendent shook his head. I suppose you realize, he said, that you have both committed a very serious offense. But I won't be too hard on you, especially as you have shown yourself such creditable amateurs in my line of business, he added with a smile. But I'm afraid the whole story must come out now. There's really no question about that. But surely, said John, there's no one to try now, so you can't have a trial. I don't see why you should want to drag the whole beastly story to light. It'll... Pardon me, Miss Cooper. There'll have to be an inquest on Carter Woodman, and you and Mr. Ellery will have to tell what you know. But can't we say he committed suicide? It's quite true he did, and leave it at that, said John. Yes, Ellery put in. And give evidence about his embarrassed financial position as a reason for taking his life? Quite impossible, said the Superintendent. I fear the story must come out. But as there will be no trial, there will not really be very much publicity. You will do best to tell the whole story at the inquest. It'll all blow over very soon. But what about poor Helen? "I mean, Mrs. Woodman," said John. "I'm afraid she'll have to bear it as best she can." So it was done. At the inquest, the whole story was told, both by John and Ellery and by Superintendent Wilson. The papers the next day were full of it, and full too of compliments both to the professionals and to the amateurs on the skill shown in unravelling the mystery. But that same day came a parliamentary crisis. The old Prime Minister resigned, and a new one, in the name of conservatism and tranquillity, took his place. Parliament was dissolved, and the drums beat and the beacons flared in anticipation of an appeal to the people. In a few days, the Brooklyn mystery was forgotten, except by those directly concerned and by a few specialists in the records of crime. John and Ellery, of course, are married and quite disgustingly rich now that Sir Vernon is dead. They live at Liskeet House when they are in town, and Ellery is managing director of the Brooklyn Corporation. He has made many attempts to get Marianne to return to the stage, but perhaps he will yet succeed, for he has just written a play in which she agrees the leading part was made for her. Family matters keep Joan rather busy at present, but her first play, produced a year ago by Brooklyn Corporation, was a great success. She is thinking of collaborating with her husband and another with a strong detective interest. Ellery summed up the situation the other day when he and Joan were talking over the days of the great Brooklyn mystery. "Well, my dear, it was sad about poor old George, but you must agree that the other two were really a good riddance. And although one of them had been in a way a suitor, I think Joan did agree. But all she said was, 'Poor Marian.'" The end of chapter 37. The end of The Brooklyn Murders by G. D. H. Cole.